Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to speak on this bill, indicate I will be the lead speaker for the opposition. The Labor Party applauds the Greens for their efforts to support critical workers and essential services during the COVID-19 emergency. This is a far cry, Mr. President, from the Liberal government, who have taken many opportunities during this emergency to make it harder or not support workers. The government has not supported reasonable return to work proposals. The government sought to strip job security provisions from enterprise agreements. This includes parts of enterprise agreements that protect frontline and disability workers from job cuts and privatisation. The government have continually extended 24-hour shop trading, allegedly in response to COVID-19, but then refuses to support better protection for retail workers, checkouts, people who stock shelves, cleaners and managers. The government sought to suspend traineeships and apprenticeships for months beyond these emergency measures, and the government continues to try and gut out labour hire legislation that protects some of the most vulnerable workers. In this context, Mr. President, I applaud the Greens for bringing this bill to the Parliament. However, Mr. President, the Labor Party has introduced legislation that I've spoken about today and has introduced legislation previously in the other place, and the Labor Party will be voting in preference for our scheme. This position was formed after consulting with organisations over a number of weeks that represent workers. Mr. President, as I've indicated, Labor has previously introduced COVID-19 return to work bills in the other place and now in this place. Although Labor welcomes the efforts of the Greens, we will not be voting for the legislation, noting that we prefer our own bill.
The Honourable Ms Benares.
Thank you, Mr. President. Can I indicate our support for the second reading of this bill? It means the link between the suspected or diagnosed COVID-19 in the workplace does not need to be established. It's automatically presumed on account of the face-to-face nature of the work of our frontline workers here in SA. It means unnecessary, expensive and stressful legal proceedings can be avoided. It means frontline workers can instead go on with the mammoth task at hand with a little more ease. Mr. President, in real terms, it applies to those frontline workers who would find it difficult, if not impossible, to maintain social distancing from the public at work. They should not have to choose between a paycheck and potentially being exposing others to COVID-19 if they have a cough. Designated workers have played a pivotal role in preventing the further spread of COVID-19 within our community, and I, for one, am very grateful for all that they've done and continue to do each and every day. They are the frontline workers who have bravely risked their own health during the pandemic for the benefit of others, often to the detriment of themselves and their families. And I'll remind honourable members of a report just overnight that a railway ticket officer in the UK died from COVID-19 after being spat and coughed at work, which was extremely disturbing. It's an example of the worst-case scenario, a scenario that would have been crossed the minds of many of the frontline workers that we're talking about today, and yet they continue to risk their own health and safety for the greater good. They do so having even temporarily relocated from their families so that they are not exposed to the same risks. I note that the opposition also has a bill, and I'm sure that we'll be working through these issues in the chamber in the coming weeks. I, with those words, indicate certainly our support for the second reading of this bill and look forward to further debate.
Call the Treasurer.
Mr. Chairman, President, Government, as I've indicated, publicly strongly opposes this bill and indeed other pieces of legislation proposed by members of the Labor opposition, Mr. President. Put simply, Mr. President, this bill and the other bills seek to amend the Return to Work Act to reverse the onus of proof in the Act for COVID-19 claims. This would simply mean that workers who are diagnosed with COVID-19 are presumed to have contracted the disease from their employment unless Return to Work SA or the employer, in the case of the Crown and other self-insurers, can prove otherwise. Mr. President, the current law is that, as with other workers' compensation claims, as a worker who is diagnosed must prove on the balance of probabilities that the disease arose from employment. Mr. President, in relation to this particular bill, The range of employees proposed to be covered, if I can summarise briefly, are all emergency services workers, including but not limited to CFS, MFS and SES, certain members of the police force who face-to-face contact, employees. Most of these remaining categories are those who have face-to-face contact, employees who work in the healthcare industry or healthcare service, passenger transport services or freight transport industry, the aged care industry or an aged care service, childcare industry or a childcare service, education industry or an education service, including preschool, school and tertiary education, employees who work in the retail industry, which is a very large group, employees of courts and tribunals, employees employed in correctional services, institutions or youth training centres, employees who work in the hospitality industry or hospitality service, which together with the retail one would be an extraordinarily broad category, Mr President. Employees who work in the disability care industry, employees who work in the industry or a service of provision of refugees, halfway houses, homeless shelters, etc. Employees who work in library services, and then any other persons who work in a service or industry prescribed by regulations, Mr President. So, Mr President, it's an extraordinarily wide category of employees. We're not just talking about what is most often mentioned, frontline services such as doctors and nurses. We are talking about an extraordinarily wide range of employees, Mr President. This particular bill also includes another extraordinary provision, Mr President, which says that provision that states that a worker is entitled to weekly income support payments because they've been diagnosed with COVID-19 will continue to be entitled to income support for a further 3 weeks after the worker returns to work or ceases to be incapacitated by the injury. What this is saying, Mr President, is that an insurer or an employer would have to pay a worker who is fit to work, has returned to work, an additional 3 weeks' pay on top of any remuneration they are already paying to the employee. Now, Mr President, I guess the first instance is that those who are moving this particular supporting this legislation or moving the legislation need to explain what the particular problem is in the first instance. That is, how is the current system failing? There seems to be this assumption that because workers are placing themselves in difficult and dangerous situations depending on the nature of their particular work, that in some way they are being left high and dry, that is, they are not being covered or compensated by the current workers' compensation scheme. And I think the challenge to those who want to see this legislative change, they need to indicate the evidence for that particular claim. It can't just be the vibe or the feeling or this is the issue. Someone actually needs to describe what is the evidence for the particular problem that the legislation seeks to resolve. Now, Mr President, as of the first week of May, the Office of the Commissioner for Public Sector Employment advises that there have been no COVID-19 claims at that particular time made by public sector employees. Return to Work SA has advised that they have received 4 COVID-19 claims. At this stage, none have been rejected, 1 has been accepted, and the other 3 are being determined, Mr President. These are all obviously, given the nature of the pandemic, only recent claims. So unlike some of the other workers' compensation claims which sometimes take years winding their way through the Employment Tribunal and various other jurisdictional issues, Mr President, at this stage not one COVID-19 claim has been rejected. Now, Mr President, that's not to say that there won't be more COVID-19 claims, but at this stage there is just no evidence to indicate where the current system is actually failing. The other issue, Mr President, that I think those who support this legislation is that there was not similar legislation in relation to previous pandemics such as SARS, sudden acute respiratory syndrome, MERS, the Middle East respiratory syndrome, and a range of others. There was not, under the former Labor government, any endeavours to introduce similar legislation in relation to the capacity for people to contract those particular viruses Mr. President, and to be injured or to lose their life as a result of those particular pandemics, Mr. President. So, Mr. President, I think that's the first issue, and that people have to actually take those issues up and explain, I guess, why it is that the current legislation, which was put in place by the former Labor government, supported by the then Liberal opposition, is not meeting the challenge that is confronting us at the moment. Now, Mr. President, very few pieces of legislation I've seen have developed or resulted in such widespread and vehement opposition to the legislation from right across the board, Mr. President. And given the time, Mr. President, I'm not in a position to read through all of the submissions. It may well be when we come to debate the Labor Party legislation at a later stage, we might be able to indicate the strength and the vehemence of the opposition. But Mr. President, let me just indicate, for example, the communication from the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman, Ms Kate Carnell, AO, who gave her opinion on both bills, both the Labor bill and this particular bill. And, Mr. President, Kate Carnell indicated small businesses all over the country are doing their utmost to protect the health of their employees and keep them employed through these difficult times. COVID-19 is highly communicable, and suggesting that if an individual contracts the disease, their workplace is undoubtedly the source in the absence of any evidence entirely ignores the very real possibility of infection elsewhere. Such an assumption places unfair onus and significant additional burden on small business operators. Small business employs hundreds of thousands of South Australians, and legislating these proposals would lead to small businesses having to reconsider the ongoing employment and engagement of staff. With Australia's unemployment rate set to rise, legislation which disincentivises hiring staff would be an act of self-harm on behalf of the South Australian Parliament. That is the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman, Mr. President, giving her independent opinion on the legislation. Now, Mr. President, the two others I'll refer to, I'll refer briefly to some of the others in quick detail, but the two others I place some sort of detail on, Mr. President, because these groups, Mr. President, I work very closely with. We don't always agree on issues, Mr. President, but these groups represent the independent supermarkets of South Australia, Mr. President. The small independent retailers in South Australia, Mr. President, which some members in this chamber highlight often, that they need to be protected in terms of their employment and the ongoing importance of the small independent retailers in the South Australian environment. So, Mr. President, the master grocers of Australia represent Drake's, Romeo's, Chapley's, Udunda Foodland Group and a number of other independent retailers, Mr. President. And their position is that they strongly oppose, MGA strongly opposes the amendments proposed to the Return to Work Act as referred to in the amendments proposed in the legislation, again referring to both the Labor bill and to this particular bill. And, Mr. President, they say in part, and I won't read their whole letter, however, where it is totally beyond the ability of the employer to do anything other than offer all protective measures available, it is unacceptable to expect the employer to assume responsibility simply because there is no one or nothing else to blame. It is anticipated the unemployment rate in Australia will reach in excess of 10% in 2020, which would have been higher without the injection of billions of dollars by state and federal governments to help save jobs. The proposed amendments to the Act would dissuade many employers to even contemplate employing staff. It is clear that if these amendments are permitted in the Act, then regardless of what the employer does, he or she will be liable to compensate the employee on the basis that he or she has not provided a safe workplace. Employers will simply not be prepared to take the risk of employing valuable staff if they are to be blamed for the consequences of an uncontrollable disease, despite all the care they may take to protect their employees. MGA opposes the proposed amendments to the Act. As an employer organisation, MGA understands that there is often need to make provisions to workers' compensation legislation to provide for the safety and well-being of employees. However, MGA believes that the amendments to the Return to Work Act COVID-19 are both unnecessary and potentially damaging to the current and future economy of South Australia. I repeat, that's the group that represents the independent retailers, Drakey's, Romeo's, Chapley's, Udunda Foodland Group, a group that we often hear, and I agree, are important employers in South Australia, and they're trenchantly opposed, vehemently opposed to these particular pieces of legislation. My other very good friends who represent the independent retailers is the South Australian Independent Retailers Group, Mr President, and they represent, as members know, some Foodland, IGA and Friendly Grocer stores, Mr President. Now, Mr President, they say that they strongly oppose these pieces of legislation for the following reasons. This will set a precedent that all future widespread diseases be covered by the WorkCover system, and there is a high risk employers will be held automatically responsible for all future diseases' impact on staff. This is a precedent that should not be set. Employers have no control of employees outside of the workplace, and employers should not automatically be held responsible for the results of their employees' behaviour outside of work. The bill effectively takes away all responsibility for an individual's own behaviour and deems it the employer's responsibility that a person became ill due to the virus. Employers should not be held accountable for employees' behaviour outside of the workplace. Many fines are currently being issued for irresponsible behaviour by individuals regarding the lack of social distancing. Why should an employer be held responsible for that type of behaviour if the person became ill as a result of poor behaviour outside of work? In the current environment, many workers are not working from home. The home may then be deemed a workplace under the Act. It is difficult for employers to monitor employees' behaviour at the home workplace. It is also difficult for employers to restrict who visits the home workplace: children, partners, neighbours, family, tradespeople. All of these visitors to the home workplace carry a risk of introducing the virus or becoming infected. If a virus is transmitted to these people at a home workplace, then they are likely to have been deemed to have been injured at a workplace and the employer liable for their illness as well, and not just the employees. Sadly, as we have seen, the virus causes death. Under the bill, if the illness is automatically the employer's responsibility, then so will a death of a person who happens to be an employee of the industries covered by the bill be automatically deemed a workplace death. This means employers and the directors will be held responsible for workplace deaths of people who may have caught the virus outside the workplace. How is that fair or logical? As a result, the cost to the employers and the WorkCover system this bill will be immense. Further on, it is unclear how a person with more than one job will be treated if they get the virus. Which workplace will be deemed to have caused the virus to be caught by the employee, and hence which employer will be held responsible where there are multiple employers? And finally, the South Australian Independent Retailers and its members take workplace safety seriously and have a genuine interest in providing safe workplaces, but we believe this bill is an unreasonable burden on employers and should be defeated. And, Mr President, I quoted those three at length because, one, the national profile of the Australian Small Business Ombudsman, but the second two because those two particular groups represent South Australian small independent retailers. As I said, we've often heard, Mr President, them being quoted in this chamber as being important employers in the South Australian context, and they are vehemently, trenchantly opposed to this legislation as being unfair, unreasonable on them as employers, and that would be, in the words of some, an act of self-harm by this parliament to be supporting legislation of this type through the South Australian Parliament. Now, Mr President, without going through all the others, the Return to Work SA has indicated their opposition to the bill. The self-insurers of South Australia indicated their opposition. The Australian Convenience and Petroleum Marketers Association, which represent all the on-the-runs, BP, Mobil, Viva Energy, Adelaide Fuels and Caltex Woolworths, strongly oppose the legislation. The Motor Traders Association is strongly opposed to the bill. The Australian Association of Convenience Stores, the peak body for convenience industry, strongly opposed it. They went so far as saying that if this bill was to pass, they would consider advising its members to close their doors on account of the risks they face being elevated to an unsustainable level. The submission went on to describe the draft Labor bill as entirely inappropriate and grossly unethical. The Australian Retailers Association strongly opposes the bill. The Council of Small Business Organisations of Australia, so this is the national organisation, became aware of the bills and is strongly opposed to it. The Australian Industry Group strongly opposed to the bill. Master Grocers I've counted, the South Australian Independent Retailers. The Master Builders Association doesn't support the bill. The Australian Lottery and Newsagents Association doesn't support the bill. The Pharmacy Guild of Australia doesn't support the bill. The Australian Hairdressing Council strongly opposes the bill, and Business SA has also expressed concerns about the legislation, Mr President. So, Mr President, as I said, the one thing these two pieces of legislation have done is they have united almost every employer group in the state, from big to small, from independent to large, Mr President, to say this is ill-thought-out, ill-considered legislation which will be an act of self-harm at a time when we're trying to protect employment in South Australia, Mr President. To blame employers for circumstances where an employee may have contracted the disease from a bus or from a nightclub or from a hotel or from a bar or from a mate who came around, visited them at home, or wherever it might happen to be, that the automatic assumption is that it's the employer who's to blame. And, Mr President, it's for those reasons, as I said, that the government strongly opposes this legislation, proposed legislation, and indeed the Labor bills.
The Honourable Ms Franks to sum up.
Thank you, Mr President. I'd like to thank the members who have made a contribution today, particularly the Honourable Connie Benares and SA Best, who've indicated their support for this bill. I note the words of the Labor opposition as the lead speaker that they won't be supporting this bill today because they prefer their version of the bill. I thank them for acknowledging the leadership, and I did, in my original speech, note that it was something that the Greens had discussed both around the various states and territories and at a federal level around about the same time that the Labor leader announced the Labor Party's intention to move in the other place on that, and certainly it is no surprise, therefore, that our bills are not dissimilar. Some key differences that I'd like to just point and put on the record at the moment are the commencement date, the automatic and retrospective commencement date for this bill that is contained in the Greens version that I'd like the Labor Party to consider, as well as the broad range of people-facing workers. Because while the Honourable Rob Lucas may have trotted out references to the fact that it's accepted that nurses and doctors and health professionals be considered and protected, the very point of this particular pandemic and this particular virus is that it's those who are, while we are told generally to stay at home, are putting in the very path of danger by the fact that they're in people-facing industries. The JB Hi-Fi workers who are put in incredibly cramped spaces, unable, without PPE, unable to distance themselves socially in an appropriate way, who are crying out through RAFWU, their union, for assistance with that, for guidance and support with that. These are the very workers that we don't often think of as essential workers who have suddenly become the essential workers of this pandemic. It is different to SARS and previous pandemics. Not in my lifetime have we had the police commissioner in charge of the state and suspended every single law of this state should we need to for the purpose of this pandemic. Not in my lifetime have we seen the streets empty and people homeless, housed in what I would point out to the Treasurer are refuges, not refugees, because this is the thing. People are being told to stay home, yet some people are being told to go to work. And if they didn't go to work, then we would be far weaker in terms of our economy, let alone our society, and let alone for those particular businesses who rely on the workers that we are currently putting in harm's way. I'm glad that the Honourable Treasurer in his contribution has reflected on something that he tweeted, and as I noted in my second reading contribution on this on April 7th, that in fact you are already covered for COVID-19 under our return to work legislation. So no employer need think that that is not the case. What this bill does is it identifies those workers who are and have been deemed to be essential and we are putting in harm's way. We are risking their very lives to keep our society going. I note that earlier on today, the Honourable Treasurer noted that he held some of these workers in very high regard. Well, I didn't hear the voice of any of the workers represented in his reflections and his consultations today. And I note that we've had not one, not two, but three, I think now, emergency COVID bills, and not a skerrick of consultation has been done on those. And I note that the Treasurer, in his enthusiasm, has extended shop trading hours and has cited public health advice. And yet, I've yet to see any substantiation of real public health reasons why we extended our shopping trading hours at the very time that other states reduced theirs. I note that poor behaviour outside of the workplace has been put down as a reason for these workers to not be given the presumptive treatment that they've been put in harm's way and that is how they have contracted the disease, should they do so. How outrageous. Poor behaviour of these workers who we are absolutely relying on 24/7 right now, without whom the state would have ground to a halt. It is cited that this bill is a disincentive for employers to employ people. I think this bill is a disincentive for employers to put their workers in harm's way, to needlessly subject them to being put in danger. And that is the very point that this bill makes. The Treasurer also remarked that workers were placing themselves in this danger. The workers are going to work. They are directed by their employers, and there is a duty of care to protect our workers under this Act, the relevant Act, and in this state. Now, while the Treasurer may dismiss as the vibe, the feeling, certainly I note that the vibe and the feeling went a long way to, I think, the restriction on the provision of alcohol at our dining tables now that we've started to serve food. I understand the South Australian state stands alone in banning the ability for somebody to have a beer or a wine or a sneaky gin with their meals in coming weeks, and no public health evidence has been provided for that move. That is simply the vibe of the thing. And as I noted, the 24-hour, 24/7 shop trading hours enthusiasm of our Treasurer remains untamed, but that has also been very much a vibe of the thing from the Treasurer in extending our shop trading hours. Now more than ever before, that we haven't done it this way before is no longer a reason not to do it differently. We are doing so many things differently, and this is what is cited to be an uncontrollable disease by the Treasurer. I note the very fine work of the Premier and the Minister for Health and Wellbeing and the Chief Public Health Officer and her Deputy and the State Coordinator that has controlled this disease. So it is controlled. We can provide safe workplaces, and we can indeed stop blaming workers for their supposed poor behaviour outside of work when we're telling everyone to stay home and to stay safe, and yet we're putting these very people in harm's way. With those few words, I am disappointed a little that the Labor Party certainly didn't raise any discussions with me prior to making their contribution this evening, because in fact I would have been happy to work with them on this bill, and certainly would have been happy to suspend standing orders to support their bill going through tonight. And as we've now changed the sitting schedule, we have many more weeks to wait, until June indeed, before we will now debate this very important issue to provide COVID care, a presumptive COVID care, not a COVID care that blames workers for putting themselves in harm's way, but actually sends a very strong message that employers should not put their workers in harm's way, and provides that very high regard that I would hope the Treasurer does indeed wish to extend to all workers in this state.